So I'm going to call the the council's finance committee meeting of May 9, 2023 to order at 5:30 p.m. And I want to just remind anyone who's watching from the audience that this meeting is being held by Zoom. Members of the public have access to the meeting via Zoom, and please be advised that this meeting is being recorded. And I'm just going to make sure that everybody who I know is present can hear and be heard. We have several members of the council who are present, but we do not have a quorum of the council. So let me just do that quickly. And I'll start with Lynn Griesmer.
Present.
Anna Devlin Gauthier.
Present, Anna.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Bob Riegner.
Present.
Ed Holloway.
Present.
We know that Kathy's absent, and I have not seen Bernie or Felicia. And members of the council, Dorothy, you're Dorothy.
I'm here.
Pam Rooney is here.
Yeah, I am here.
Pam, you heard us. Okay, she acknowledged it. So let me just say very quickly to acknowledge that I really appreciate the school committee being here for the meeting that was scheduled before I realized that today is an Amherst School Committee Day, and the meeting is that meeting has been posted. For that reason, we are not going to do public comment at the beginning of the meeting, which is what has become our normal practice, but we're going to wait until after we have a chance to talk about school budget, and we are going to go straight to that topic. And I know that there have been a series of questions that have been put together, and that they've been transmitted to the superintendent and Doug Slaughter, the school finance director. And I don't know if Allison has seen the questions that were submitted in advance or not, but we try and get the questions, if we can, as many as possible. So Anna, you have your hand up.
I do. I have a quick just disclosure. I am filing a disclosure form with the town clerk's office. My mom is an employee of the Amherst school system. However, as this budget, the town council does not determine budget items within the school budget. We merely vote on the total budget generally. So there is not a conflict of interest here. No action that I take will impact my mom's salary. So I am remaining in the room for the conversation and will be participating, but wanted to make sure that was on the record. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I see that Jennifer Taub is not here. So Jennifer, I assume you can hear us. And
okay. Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. So with that said, we have all received a copy of the budget. Was in the packet for today's meeting, and the link was sent some time ago to members of the committee. And so I hope that the other counselors have had a chance to see the budget. I don't know if there's anything that you want to say in advance, Sean, or should I just turn it over?
Yeah, I'll just quickly, Doug, I guess the best format would be to give a quick overview, and then there were a number of questions submitted for the school. So I think going through those questions, Doug, and then we can open it up to the committee just to make sure that nobody asked the same question that was already sent in.
Yeah, I think the only thing I will add is in the conversations that I had by email with Mike, wanted to give him the opportunity to give any overview also. And we wanted to focus on questions in which he might have questions that he's seen that he feels are particularly appropriate to him. He indicated that Doug could stay a little bit longer, but he has a hard stop at 6:05 so that he can switch gears and get himself ready for the school committee meeting. And I gather that Allison is also wanting to do that too. So what I would suggest is ask our superintendent to give whatever overview of the budget that he would like to give, and respond to any of the advanced questions that he thinks are particularly appropriate. And I'll come back to that again, and then see if ask the same question of Allison as chair of the committee. So
Actually, I think Allison's going to start, if that's okay, Andy.
absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted to introduce, because I know and I appreciate that the school committee approved and passed a budget that is different than the guidance and different than the budget that Paul, the town manager, has submitted to the finance committee and the town council. So I just wanted to give that sort of super high level sort of rationale and sort of update folks on the conversations that happened within the Amherst School Committee that drove us to that point. So we initially developed the budget with the 2.5% guidance that we had originally received, despite the conversations and very difficult conversations about the extent of cuts to level services. So cuts to existing currents and programs and services within our district. So yes, the budget is increasing, but because our costs are increasing at a greater extent than what the guidance of 2.5% was originally, we had to make program cuts to our existing programs and services. So when we got the great news that the guidance was being increased up to 3% due to the changes in estimates and state funding, the school committee felt very strongly that given the extreme situation and because it's impacting the student experience, the cuts to programs and services, that we wanted to try to use some of that additional funding or to preserve those positions and services to lessen the impact on the student experience as much as possible. Because of the strong outcry from the community and continued strong pressure and comments that we're receiving from the community to not make cuts and to use as much of our budget to, I mean, we have multiple open contracts right now, so we don't have that settled in terms of what our payroll is going to be landing at. Some of that is in contingency, but really wanted to honor some of the concerns that we were hearing from the community in terms of the impact that the cuts to programs and services would be having on the student educational experience. So that is the rationale behind I believe it's about 80,000. Doug can give you the exact amount of the difference between sort of the recommended budget from the town manager and the approved budget from the school committee. But that is primarily to help us preserve some of those positions and some of the programs and services in the current budget year. So I'll let Mike sort of explain more of that.
Sure. Andy, is it okay to jump right in?
Yes.
Okay. So this fiscal year, we have we're accessing potentially the last of our ESSER funds. ESSER funds were funds given to districts in the 3 waves, during from the beginning till where we currently are in the pandemic. We were really thoughtful, in my opinion, in our approach. I want to thank Doug and principals, so we had to do some things like change the infrastructure of walls at Fort River and Wildwood so that the schools had better ventilation when students returned from the lockdown time. We spent money on air purifiers for the same reason. We spent money on PPE, additional nursing staff so that students could return as safe as possible. But we also added some other items as well. And so while we did add a lot, we also knew that potentially there was going to be challenges fiscally in the future. And so in the approved budget, there's a little over $500,000 that we'd save from ESSER to supplement the existing budget to maintain most of our level of staffing and services for the next fiscal year. We are reducing some of those positions that were added. Particularly, we have a special education teacher we added in the intensive need program, and due to enrollments, that position is not needed anymore. So you'll see a reduction, but that is the only special education reduction needed. We know that our students with special needs have had faced, in general, more significant challenges than their typical peers during the period of closure and the period of COVID. And we will have to look at enrollments in the future, but at the current time, a priority of ours was maintaining that level of services and support for students with special needs. We also were able to maintain all of our mental health staffing and supports. It's come as no surprise to anyone who follows schools or reads newspapers that the pandemic was particularly hard on children, not just academically, but social emotionally. And so we maintained our suite of supports for students, with a guidance counselor, adjustment counselor, and psychologist. We've also done a significant amount of reshuffling. This isn't reflected in the budget documents, but it's been in other public documents because we have seen shifts of enrollment. For instance, Fort River's gotten a bit larger. And the other two schools over the last 5 years have reduced. So we right-sized some of our staffing disparities between the schools, which will enhance and make more efficient our service delivery at each of the schools. And so that was a couple years overdue, but now that we're back, a couple years in person, it seemed like the right approach to take. We did have some reductions off the appropriated budget in terms of paraeducators and classroom teachers. And again, those are somewhat based in enrollments, but we maintain 5 full-time specialist teachers, art, music, physical education, library, and technology in each of our 3 elementary schools. And I think that's a sort of a summary of where we are. Doug, I don't know if you want to add things now or go into the questions. I'm sensitive to the fact that Allison and I have about 15 minutes. So if there's questions that are directly for us to answer instead of Doug, we have this window of time, but there is a hard stop because we do have to get over to the high school.
Yeah, I think that the one that really is direct to what we've talked about so far is question number 1 on the sheet. And for the other members of the council and anybody else who's not seen it, it reads as follows. The school committee voted 3-2 on March 14 to approve the Amherst Elementary Schools FY24 budget, adding $84,000 and changing the reduction in staff from 4 classroom teachers to 2, reduction of paraeducators from 10 to 7, and strongly urged the superintendent and finance director to keep the 3 full-time paraeducator positions. And I note that that's was pretty much copying from the minutes of the March 14 meeting. And so the questions were, how is the $84,000 determined? What is the cost to maintain 2 classroom teachers and 3 paraeducators? What would happen to these positions in FY25? So we're really trying to determine where the $84,000 came from and how it relates to the staffing part of the motion that was made and passed on a 3-2 vote at the school committee meeting. And I see Allison's hand is up, so Allison?
Yeah, I just want to clarify, the vote was 3-2. That I can speak for myself, and I think also my colleague who also was in one of the 2 of us that voted no. It wasn't about the budget number per se. It was specifically about adding the caveat and the constraint. It was how we were going to use that additional money. The school committee, if you watch the conversation, was unanimous in sort of the desire for that additional $84,000 as I led off with, to reduce the impacts of the reduction in programs and services. Then the calculation, that number came from a calculation of the dollar value of the 3% increase in the town operating budget. So it was a straight arithmetic, and hopefully our math was reasonably accurate. But it was taking sort of that difference of that 0.5% on the town proposed operating budget, what that total dollar was, and suggesting that if that were to go all to the schools, whether it's between the elementary district and the regional district, what would that dollar value be? So that's how that's where that $84,000 came. And then looking at sort of the impacts of where a lot of the reductions were being made. Yes, there's some enrollment driven reductions that were included in the initial proposal. And what the school committee wanted to do was to reduce some of the non-enrollment driven reductions in staff. And the vote in particular was whether we were going to give guidance on which particular positions, not the number of positions, but which particular positions.
Okay, is there any follow-up questions on what Allison just said from any counselors or committee members present? Seeing none, I guess the other question that I wanted to make sure that was responded, that you had a chance to respond to, Mike, before you had to leave, was the additional question that I sent you this afternoon. And just again, so everybody's aware of what it was. Reads as according to the FY24 staffing numbers, the total number of staff both the elementary and regional schools is 344, and that's elementary 308 and regional 644 and regional 336. In 2009-10, the total staffing number was 627, elementary 299, regional 238. From 2005 to today, we have a 30% decline in elementary school enrollment and a 39% decline in middle school enrollment, the 34% decline in high school enrollment. And yet our staffing numbers are higher today than they when we had a lot more students, and asking for an explanation.
I think actually Doug can answer that one. I see his hands up.
Before Doug does, we have a quorum now for the council, and you might want to.
Yes, in addition to that, Alicia has joined, so we need to make sure. So given that we have a quorum of the council present, I'm going to call the council to order. And since all the other councilors have been checked on, I will just ask Alicia on behalf of both the Finance Committee and the council, are you present and can you hear us? And we can hear you.
Yes, thank you, Lynn.
Thank you so much, Alicia.
Okay.
So just to answer the question a little bit, I took a few minutes to look over some historical data. One of the pieces that add to staff is that we brought our food service program back in-house, and so the staffing for that has added a number of people to just shy of 20 total, I think, to our staffing. So that's one reason for an increase in number of staff, and that increases, but you would expect with a decrease in enrollment, we'd have an overall loss in staff. And I think that as you look through that sort of history, you see the changes in programming that we've done and some losses in staffing that we've had. But what you also see is an increased need in some other areas like special education, and in particular, paraprofessionals that support our students in one-to-one circumstances or special programs. And so that's really the really short answer on where those additional sort of staff FTEs come from. It's one thing to sort of identify it, it's another thing to do something about it. Certainly the superintendent and I have had some initial conversations about what do we do. We know kind of what the driver is, sort of how we approach solutions to that are an area that we need to spend some time on and think about deeply in the next year or two, because it is a difficult thing.
Right.
Yeah, I think the only two things I'd add is one is this budget, while they're ESSER funded, reduces the FTEs by 17.42. So pretty significant reduction from FY23 to FY24. think the second thing to note is, I think Paul sent a memo. Thank you, Paul, for that. Just that we recognize that, we want to maintain high quality schools and that we've got fiscal pressures. And so appreciate both Sean and Doug and the town trying to partner and thinking about how do we pave a path through to a future where we can maintain the level of support and staffing that the families and students really rightfully desire. People move here for the schools, and we can't do that without sufficient staff. And so that's the other next step on this front as well.
Matt?
Hey, Andy, I hate to do this. I'm going to have to hop off at 6, so I just want to let you know now so I don't interrupt things. And I did have a question for Doug, just on that last point. Would you be able to provide us with teacher FTEs for the past, let's say 5 years or something? I mean, I think that's interesting, the food service workers point. I don't think I was aware of that, but it would be helpful to know, sort of in terms of core instructional staff, if that holds true.
Absolutely. Happy to do that.
Yeah. Thank you. So is there anybody else who has anything that they want to follow up on right now? Because I don't know if turning back to Mike and Allison, if you've seen the questions, and if there are any that you feel you'd like to be able to speak to or you have to leave, since then Doug will be here follow up. But some of those are just pure budget questions that he can, I know he can respond to.
Yeah, Doug actually doesn't have school committee meeting tonight. There's no fiscal things on it for a change. But I also have great confidence, and Doug did share his responses with me. So I feel like he's got both a good handle of the budget, but also a good handle of the, academic operations of the school. So I feel very confident, but, appreciate folks' sensitivity to the fact that Allison and I got to hop over to an in-person meeting in a little bit. Allison, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to share, but I feel very comfortable with even the rest of the questions with Doug.
Having not seen the questions, but I trust also that Doug is going to be able to answer the questions. I probably wouldn't be able to answer them as well as he could anyway. So I was, I think the most important thing is to share sort of is to just state that was the school committee intent and desirous of not wanting to impact student experience as much as we're seeing. And that we were unanimous in that, despite the appearance of that particular vote.
Pam, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question, and it was on the consolidated spending plan sheet. And I was looking at school administration and central administration. So those are about together a little over $2 million. And so they're roughly 30% of the regular instruction cost. I wondered if the special ed, and on another sheet there was special ed administration, and I wondered if special ed administration is actually all included in the school administration number, or is it sort of part of the big cost of special education, including all of its administrators?
I can take that if you'd like. The short answer is that the special administration is largely contained within the central administration. At the school level, they're typically not in administrative roles. There are a few at the elementary, a small, not even a full FTE that would be in school administration a little bit, but most of that special education administration cost is in our central administration. Actually, right? No, I'll stay with that. See, it's right.
So turning again to the full group of counselors and committee members present, Mike and Allison have about 5 minutes left, and if there are any questions that anyone has that you feel are particularly you'd like to hear from superintendent and the school committee chair, please say so now. And Anna?
So I apologize. I was desperately trying to Google so that I could find my own answer to this question because I like to be resourceful, but I couldn't do it fast enough. So I'm asking you now. When we think about our advocacy for Chapter 70 aid and our per pupil aid that we receive, is there any difference in per pupil aid for students who are enrolled in special ed in terms of like the more intense special ed programs versus those who are in regular instruction only? Is there any differentiation in state aid there? And is that something that you all or we should be advocating for, given the increases in special ed funding I'm looking at the comparison 2020 to 24. I think it's a 3% drop in regular instruction spending. I'm curious if that's an area of advocacy that should be pursued, or if that exists. I don't know who that's directed to, and I'm sorry.
Sure. So I can make what will probably be my final comment and then pass it to Doug. So I was in a meeting yesterday with a bunch of other area superintendents, Hampshire and Franklin County, with the new Secretary of Education, Dr. Tutwiler. And I was one of the people asked to speak. Our state representative and state senator were actually there as well, which was fabulous. And my topic was fiscal cliffs, so tremendously fun, engaging and inspiring topic, I think. But my colleagues spoke about some of the other fiscal challenges, including the one you mentioned. And so Doug can get into the specifics, but in general, there's kind of two frames on it. One is, what do we do for students who receive their education outside the district because their special needs are such that their needs can't be met in our district? And there's a lot of different pieces. Our out of district costs, everyone's in the state went up 14% this year. That was state mandated increase. That's way above what anyone was budgeting for, what we've seen in the past. And the attempt to ameliorate that's been going on right now in the State House has benefited some districts and not others. It's not like on a per student basis, which might actually be like, oh, if you have these number of students, you get this increment. It's actually designed to be much more ornate than that. And the ornateness means that hold harmless districts like ourselves have a limited benefit from that. So that's like one really big significant variable in it. But as I depart, I know Doug will talk about some of the other pieces as well. But thank you all for having us, and good luck with the rest of your meeting.
Thanks for representing us yesterday.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Good night.
So just to add a little bit more to that, I think that if you look at the Chapter 70 formula itself, yes, it does have components of it that take into consideration a number of categories of student, ELL students, special education, et cetera, et cetera. However, for us, because of where we sit relative to our current level of funding, our number of students, et cetera, we generally fall into sort of what they call the hold harmless. And so we just get a per student sort of addition to our base. But nonetheless, in calculating that sort of base amount is that those different kinds of students. And so there are factors there that are part and parcel of the formula. Could it help us more? Yeah, it could help us more, but it would also help everybody else more. So it is there, and it's a as Sean Mangano can tell you too, it's a pretty complex formula. Is a lot of I think a lot of political energy went into sort of finding that balance. Are there other ways, as the superintendent suggested, relative to the out of district placements and the increase there to help mitigate some of those increases? There are some other avenues of advocacy that could have a much more direct and immediate impact for us.
Thank you. And yeah, the Chapter 70 formula is a fun maze to try to learn. So I appreciate you kind of explaining it to me in simple terms.
Yeah, Sean?
This is a question for Doug. I wish I asked it when Mike and Allison were here, but Doug, have you heard anything from the Department of Ed that breaks down the governor's proposal for the Fair Share Amendment in terms of what it might mean for school districts, or if it means nothing for school districts? Has there been any guidance from them on it?
There hasn't, to my knowledge.
Okay.
I think the initial proposal from the governor put almost all of it into post-secondary education. I haven't heard that that's changed, so I'm not sure where that Senate Ways and Means budget came out today. I didn't get a chance to look at whether they had any proposals in there or not. So I haven't heard anything to the contrary. So right now, elementary and secondary education not currently benefited.
Yeah, I mean, I've been having discussions on this topic, also through my role on the Fiscal Policy Committee at the MMA. And I think we just have to recognize and continue to advocate for it. The MMA's solution is a significant increase in the dollar amount per student for the so-called minimum aid communities, which is about 240 of those communities, including us and some of our ones we're frequently compared to, like Northampton. The result is that if you take the governor's recommendation, which was $30 per student, that amounted to less than 0.5% or about 0.5% for most districts, and that were in that category, which is totally inadequate to even come close to meeting inflation costs, and especially when you combine it with other funds available to cities and towns, that it's a big problem. The question is, how do you come up with a solution to it other than that, which the House Ways and Means did some, and then took back some when it got to the floor. It was not, it's just, we're now waiting in the Senate, so I'll be very interested to look at the Senate Ways and Means Committee budget later tonight too, to get a better understanding of that. The only other thing that I've been able to think about as I've gone through it is something that we have no power to do, and it's just a matter of creating a dialogue about it. That is to make the implementation of the Student Opportunity Act over more years, so that a larger amount could be allocated if the legislature isn't going to give more money or has no more money because of the concerns now about revenue. Then elongating the implementation of the Student Opportunity Act to make sure that the legislative process and DESE are conscious of all schools and not just the schools in the greatest need. I mean, it's a tough and complicated issue. Other questions on this topic? Because if not, then let's go back. You want to just go back to the questions, Doug?
Sure, and I'll be happy to just kind of walk through each of those in turn and
Sure.
for each one and let people ask questions. The second question, and I'll skip some of the parts of it that are about the book that you got. So there was indication in our reporting that with the 6th grade move to middle school, there's some economic circumstances that require the district to lean on non-recurring revenues until we do that. So there's some efficiencies we can gain with moving the 6th grade. By delaying that, we're going to have to lean on some non-recurring revenues to do that. And the question was, well, what would be the revenue? Right now, that's ESSER funds. So we have, as the superintendent indicated, about $500,000 worth of ESSER funds that we're going to use to help us through the next fiscal year, and that will help to cover some of those costs that we will hopefully not have in the future once we move to 6th grade because of the efficiencies and overlap with the regional district that we can take advantage of there. So, any follow-ups on that one? No.
Didn't Paul, didn't you allocate some ARPA funds to help with the transition to the 6th grade to the middle school? So
Do you want me to answer that one, Paul? Yeah, so when the 6th grade transition was going to happen this fall, there was a significant number. There were a couple different projects for the schools, but the largest of which was providing transition funding for that transition. Since that got delayed, we're having discussions with the schools around what happens to that funding, because now it likely won't happen within the window of ARPA. So it's part of our sort of second round planning going on.
I think that we're all conscious, and I think you'll be getting back to this question later too, is the limits to the funds that we have from ARPA and ESSER, and what we're going to do to keep things going when that cliff happens.
Right. Yep.
So Doug, I'm going to go back to you. Unless Pam, you have a question on this.
Yeah, do we have a number for the actual cost of establishing the 6th grade at the junior high or middle school? I thought I saw a number somewhere that talked about the 7th through 12th grade as, you know, sort of a consolidated chunk. And there was a number for that, but there was no mention of the 6th grade. So are we not going to wrap the 6th graders into the regional school bucket? That's really the question. And do we have a cost for it if we don't wrap them into the budget? Oh, I think it was what I saw was the maybe the administrative structure of teachers and superintendents and whatever.
So I can answer that to some extent. So in our initial work in thinking about and working on the transition of moving 6th grade into the middle school building, you know, the conversations with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, you know, they were very clear that barring a change to the regional agreement, we would have to operate the 6th grade as its own school within a school. And with that separation, it poses some challenges relative to leveraging all of the overlapping staff in quite the same way. You can do it, but it's a little more complicated. But there's certain things you have to still do as an independent school for 6th grade, you know, from a reporting standpoint, staffing, et cetera, that were part of the complications that contributed to us putting a bit of a pause on this. That being said, subsequent to that, we also have heard from, you know, the superintendent has heard from some conversations he's had with DESE around regional agreements that they're more willing to entertain slight adjustments to regional agreements as opposed to the traditional modality where that if you opened your regional agreement was a wholesale reconstruction kind of thing that took a very significant effort to do. With that more targeted, you know, changes being allowed or being considered, you know, that gives us an opportunity to perhaps, you know, leverage that to help us out and mitigate some of those potential costs that we'd have if we had an independent 6th grade school in the building here, in the middle school building. But those are, you know, questions we'll be working on and resolving over the next couple of years, and hopefully, you know, there might be a way to perhaps modify a regional agreement to make it work better for the, you know, both the Amherst Elementary and the regional school district. Those questions are pretty open at the moment on that front.
Okay, we're going to go on to the next question since another.
Yeah, so the next question is number 3 on the list was a bit of confusion about, and I fully understandable in looking at the minutes on the reduction of 10 paraeducators and then the subsequent school committee motion. So the school committee was trying to, you know, the overall reduction in paraeducators was 10 FTE. And they would like, you know, in their motion and the addition of the 84,000, and that, you know, was all about restoring 3 positions. They provided suggestion to the superintendent and myself relative to who they thought that should be, which would be the library paraeducators is who they were suggesting would be those 3 if at all possible. So the total number of reduction was 10. They were trying to move it back to 7, and that difference of 3 in their opinion and their recommendation to the superintendent was the library paraprofessionals.
You can just keep going and
Okay.
see.
Next on the list is a reference to the trend analysis under custodial spending for the district, and I have to admit this is definitely my fault. So if you're looking at the graph that's under a trend analysis, the increase from fiscal 23 to 24 looks rather profound, and some of that's understandable by virtue of great steps and COLAs offered to the custodial staff, plus some additions to our summer staff and substitutes because of the increase in minimum wage up to $15. But the biggest reason for the big jump in what you see on the graph is the fact that the fiscal 23 budgeted salary numbers were not adjusted to reflect the new contract. So we were developing the fiscal 24 budget. Well, let me go back a step. We were developing the fiscal 23 budget and started fiscal 23, and we made and we resolved during our development of fiscal 23, we resolved the contract with the custodial staff, but those changes weren't formally introduced into the budget at this point. We will make those corrections by end of year, obviously, but it does in this case make the jump look a little higher because those are our pre-settlement of contract wage estimates for that budget in there. So that makes the jump like 10% instead of more like 4 or 5. And so that's the real reason that jumps as much as it does. And so I'm happy to answer. That wasn't necessarily the most clean description of what happened, but it's really more an artifact of an update to the fiscal 23 budget that hasn't happened. So next is trend analysis for special education IDA. It says the grant funds fluctuate between the 3 districts. Is that one grant to 3 districts, and is it common? And the answer is yes. So we have our regional school district serves as a financial agent for our IDEA, which is a special education grant that helps us in terms of just sort of management and paperwork and that sort of thing relative to that grant, which is a fairly large grant. It serves as the financial agent for that. And so we have staff that work, for example, we have staff that work in our elementary schools that are paid from the regional school district because they're fully funded by that grant. But the actual amounts for each district vary a little bit from year to year based on student need and our application to the federal government for those IDA funds. And so that causes some variability there. And what's the other point I make on that? And no, it's not very common. I would say there's very, very few districts that have a structure like we do. There are a few, but very, very few. And so I don't think it's common that you would have a single district acting as the financial agent for 3. I'm sure it exists in some other places because it's certainly allowed by the grant, but it's not very common. Right. So the next question, which was about the bilingual education grant, and we're showing that we're not expecting any funding from that, and how will that affect the Comanantes program at Fort River? The interesting thing about that grant is it has been a grant that the state has funded during the fiscal year with the expectation that you will exhaust those funds in that same fiscal year. And as such, we budget expecting not to get it. We've been fortunate to get it, and it provides a tremendous amount of funding and opportunity for us to augment what we have budgeted relative to that program and those services that we offer in and around that program. So we budget the Comanantes program, assuming we won't get the grant, and then if we do, which we have been fortunate the last several years, then we leverage those funds to enhance that program even more. From my perspective, as someone who's trying to budget and plan and be thoughtful about some of the stuff, it's a difficult circumstance. It doesn't make it easy to budget just because you can't count on those funds, but nonetheless, they are very supportive of our program and helpful to augment what we already have in our budget.
Have they made a budget decision for the next year yet, or?
Not that I'm aware of, no. Unfortunately, we have a couple of grants. There's a smaller one that we've gotten in special education, more around mental health, and say student services, not really special education. And sometimes they award them. I mean, the bilingual grant, there have been years where we're awarded the grant in February and have to exhaust the funds by June. And depending on how much money that is, that gets harder to do and try to be thoughtful about the use of those funds. And so they haven't yet made decisions, to my knowledge, about that for the next year. All right. Question 7, which is what happens with ESSER funded positions in fiscal 25. We have in this budget eliminated all ESSER funded positions, so those positions are essentially being removed from our budget, so that all of the funds can be used for just general budget support of existing sort of programs and staff. And so in fiscal 25, we won't have any of those to reduce. Question 8 is, do you do projected budgeting for future years? If so, what do you project and what is the adjustment strategy? What I've written as a response here is that with 3 of our 6 union contracts not settled yet, it's difficult to make good projections out into the future years. We do some forecasting in regard to that and try to have an anticipation of what that's going to look like. And I think once we settle the contracts, we'll take a deeper look at our projection for future years. And I think that, you know, barring any real strong changes to where we are from a revenue standpoint, I think it's going to be difficult to maintain things exactly as they are. So I think we're going to have a pretty significant conversation about our programmatic stuff and our, you know, what our programs are, how we do it. And I think we're going to have to do a deep dive relative to that. I don't think we're going to have a sudden drop in enrollment that lowers our costs significantly. I don't think we're going to have a huge influx of Chapter 70 money or any other funding from the state that's going to sort of solve the sort of general trajectory of our costs. And so we're likely to have a real deep conversations about how we sustain ourselves in the future, keep our programmatic offerings, you know, competitive and appropriate for the kids and as rich as the community expects them to be. And I think this ties back to what Mike indicated earlier and Paul and Sean spoke to, is that we're going to look to work with a small group of folks from the school side and the town side to look into some things we might be able to do relative to being more sustainable as we move ahead, and ways we can leverage and benefit from cooperative exchange between school and town, and think about how we might, you know, manage or mitigate some cost increases in the future and help us sustain ourselves out into future years.
Okay. Other questions? Looking at the Lynn?
Thanks, Doug. I have a couple of questions. First of all, could the questions please be added to our packet? And second, Doug, thank you for spending time on the responses. I want to go back to the Comandantes program, and the grant that you refer to that we don't know if and when it's coming is from state or federal money?
It is state money.
Okay. It's a little, I mean, I understand the need to budget in advance for the program so that it doesn't go away if the funds don't appear. How much are those funds? And when they do appear, my question would be, is there any opportunity to release some of those funds that are presently dedicated to the Comandantes program to other program funding?
So, so of course I didn't look up what those actually are. They have been pretty significant, I would say, as far as the grant funding there. And I don't think I have that easily in hand, but it is and has been, I want to say, you know, $180,000 to $200,000 kind of size of numbers. They may be a little larger in some years versus others. You know, there are some restrictions on what the grant can be spent on. There's some non-supplanting rules generally around the grant, so you can't sort of swap one thing for another. So there's some limitations there, but certainly, you know, it does relieve certain stresses. So it you know, in the broader general effect, does it you know, the rising tide lifts all boats in a way. So if there are pressures in other parts of the budget, you know, can we make a shift to cover things that way? Certainly. I think we've been fortunate that we haven't needed to do much of that. But there are a tremendous number of things we've been able, I think, to add to the program by virtue of having that funding that really enrich it and make it even better. because we've been able to use that funding to get more materials and resources and to do more to support the program. That just, it wouldn't make the program not function or not be good. It's just better because of that. And so, we've been able to enhance that program, I think, in a way that's pretty significant. And that's been really helpful. And at the same time, because of the limitation of the grant, we really couldn't sort of leverage it elsewhere, but it does have a pretty broad effect.
I want to be very clear. I wasn't suggesting we use the grant money
Right.
elsewhere. That
right.
My
No, that's
contract pays, no, that's not allowed. But the issue was that you have existing town, state, whatever, you have existing other budget money that you've already used for the program. Getting the money from the state for the Comandante's program, does that help release some of the already budgeted money for other programs? That was why. And you've answered that. I just want to make sure I wasn't suggesting the expenditure of grant funds in any way, shape, or form. I think that's all.
Okay, Anna, did you have something?
Yeah, and I guess by now Doug's getting used to, or is already used to, my very half-formed questions. So Doug, I apologize that this is another one of those. I was looking at the transportation line, and I know that it's a relatively small, 2.9%, right? But I'm trying to reckon with a couple things, and I'm hoping you can help me tease them out. So we're up about $200,000 since 2020 in transportation costs. And I believe we started switching to electric buses in 22, right? I was looking at where the budget started to change. And so we're saving about 20K a year, it looks like, on gas, but I'm curious how I believe, I don't think you've gotten the newest, we got a grant to help with a new electric school bus last year. But I'm curious if you can talk about the changes both in our purchasing of electric buses, but also if that's impacted the contracts that we have with outside companies. And if you kind of where you're predicting the transportation costs going in the next couple of years, are they going to stay at relatively that 2.9%, or do you foresee a change? I think that there's a lot of reasons to go with electric buses, the health of the planet being a really great one. And at the same time, one of the big appeals to electric buses is that hopefully we save money on fuel costs, right? And I know that we're navigating some issues with maintenance of those buses, but I'm curious if you've got projections on transportation and where you see that going, or if you have any insights that I'm really missing. I was trying to just look at the difference, because we're looking at about a 60K increase this year in transportation, roughly. Yeah.
So I think there's a few things I'll point out here. One is that we currently have one electric bus, which has had its issues from a performance standpoint, but it's sort of a first generation for a new manufacturer. So that's going to happen to some extent. We've had, and if you've been involved with capital conversations, ongoing dialogue about what's our next step relative to that. I think the thing I'll point out that it's probably driving things more so than anything else is that we have a hybrid system of how we do transportation. So part of our transportation cost is our buses to drive our kids around, but we also have contracts with third-party vendors that do some of it as well. Those contracts and the price in those contracts are have a built-in inflation factor. So they're based on the sort of New England area consumer price index and how it's changed over the last 12 months. So for the coming year, that overall increase in the contract was about 7.5%, I believe, if I remember correctly. I was going to say 7.94, but I know that's the health insurance, so it's not 7.94. I think it's 7.5% or just shy of 7.5%. So that drove all that up. The other factor that plays into our transportation costs is how many students we have and how far we drive them. So in the calculation of how to divvy up the costs between our regional district, our Amherst district, our Leverett and Shutesbury elementary districts that also are in and part of that system, it's driven by how many students and how far. And so sometimes the cost increase are driven by how many students we have. So if we've had an uptick or a sustaining of students in our Amherst district and a drop in students in our regional district, that's going to boost our cost. So those are multiple factors that all play into this a little bit. I think depending on how, generally speaking, our bus contract is likely to stay fairly similar. So as inflation goes, it will go. And then depending on enrollment, it'll make a little difference as to how our trends will be. Certainly, if we start shifting to more electric vehicles, and I think that's a general direction we want to head. I think, the upfront cost of those buses is pretty significant. I think the year-over-year, operating and maintenance costs are probably less. And certainly we hope to sort of recoup some of that. I think that, it's a different paradigm. So we're gonna have to think about our transportation system generally over the next couple of years as we strategize about how best to move ahead in that move to a more electrified busing and transportation system.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer.
I have a question. I have a question on buses similarly, but that is, are all the listed capital items that we've looked at through JCPC, are they actually now incorporated into this school budget, or are they separate? So when I look at the percentage of money spent on the school, the 52% of the town budget spent on the school, are those school buses, are all those capital projects, the building maintenance included in your number?
So the school budgets don't include the capital expenses. So any of those things that are in the capital budget, whether it be for the school bus or, infrastructure or those, large projects are all wholly within the capital budget. I mean, obviously we do in our budget have, some regular maintenance and custodial services and utilities and all of that sort of stuff that is in our budget. So our sort of more modest day-to-day operational, repair and maintenance of our buildings are included in there, but the larger sort of projects are in the capital budget, I should say, and separate.
We should actually add those in when we're looking at total cost for education.
Yeah, I would. I mean,
for all departments, really. I mean, you could take there's a pie chart in the capital improvement program that breaks down the capital allocation among departments. So yeah, you could look at every department and adjust for capital. It changes from year to year, so it's not as predictable as the operating budgets.
Yeah, I want to add something while we're on that topic, just for the sake of the rest of the committee and the councilors who are present. What is being discussed is really applicable to all departments, which is why there's a problem with the analysis that a member of the public put out in an email that was received by the council, and that I probably going to have to respond to as finance committee chair, because for the example that was focused on there was DPW. Well, the DPW pie chart that was being shown only was a portion, as it turns out, of DPW. It wasn't even the full DPW budget, and it didn't include any capital whatsoever. And most of our investment, a lot of our investment in the DPW is the paving and capital costs that show up through the capital improvement program. So that was not an accurate portrayal of the actual allocation of funds for DPW, and is something that I think we need to correct for the council and for the public. And there were some other problems with it I'm not going to get into. I just this was just an opportune time to point that out. Dorothy, you have a question.
Yes. So as under COVID, the state has given all kinds of extra money in different little accounts. And we know that is, as COVID funds, is going to be gone very, very soon. But also the state has reduced over time the regular amount of funding that it was giving. So do you have any clues or hints from people connected to the state that they might actually continue under some guise, or, I mean, right now it's so complicated, I couldn't possibly follow it. Don't know how you do. Giving some more funds to local districts. It would be called something, it wouldn't be called COVID money, it would be called something else. But is there any hint that they realized that people really did like getting and needed getting that extra money and going to keep getting it?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I haven't heard of anything specific that anyone's talking about. Do I think that there's some appetite for those kinds of funding? Absolutely. I think every school district would certainly appreciate some additional funding, and certainly some of the conversations relative to the special education out of district placement is one area that they're trying to sort of recognize and provide some support. I think there's some ongoing debate about how best to do that and how much it'll help a given district versus another. But I don't know of any other sort of real active conversations relative to that. I mean, I think there are some around Chapter 70 formulas, and the Mass Municipal Association, as Andy indicated earlier, is trying to advocate for greater funding there. But I don't know of any additional ones offhand.
And these are federal funds, Dorothy, so they typically come and then go away. The past times we've seen this, we had ARA funds in the late 2009, 2010. We had Ed Job funds at one point for the schools, and now we've got ARPA and ESSER. But with federal funds, I think the past experience has been they come, they are there for a short period of time, and they help, and then they cause a lot of issues when they kind of disappear, which is what we're dealing with now.
Thank
The
you.
one exception, though, was in the supplemental, they did do the school lunches and food program.
Yep.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I'm just, since, and the superintendent spoke about a little earlier, but what really stands out is that the school enrollment has declined so much over the last, it may be a period of, 10 to 15 years, and expenses have, increased. So do you look at sort of project out, have any sense of demographic trends, or if we were able to increase enrollment, whether it was families moving in, and that would be more per pupil dollars from the state, could that happen without actually increasing expenses, so that would be a gain in terms of a greater enrollment and help us reach our bottom line better?
I think the short answer is that, would increasing enrollment help us a little bit? I think it certainly would. But at the same time, the amount of state aid that we get relative to our students, has overall been decreasing. So as a percentage of our budget, the amount of support from the state is less than it was, and it has been declining for a number of years. That's also true on the town side of things. If you look at budgets from 10, 15, 20 years ago, and the percentage of the budget that was carried by the state, resources that came to cities and towns, it's a much smaller fraction than it was. And so that's a systemic problem, both for schools and towns, as far as their budgets are concerned. I think the other difficulty we run into is that often the increases that you get, or you might see relative to, some of that funding formula, don't capture the entirety of the cost. And so if you have an uptick in enrollment, but the town's property values are holding steady, then the property tax that we collect is holding steady. And Prop 2.5, the limitations there are probably generally slightly less than inflation or at inflation on it in a good year. So we're always in a sort of catch-up mode. I could go on for far longer than anyone would like about property tax and whether that's the right way to do and fund locally. Our governments, but I won't. But
long before Doug was business manager, he and I would have those conversations in that office right there. So
that's right. So it sort of back to would steadying enrollments or increasing enrollments be helpful? Probably a little bit, but probably not quite enough to really make a difference.
Okay, thank you.
The school choice experience, so we know. Anything else? Because in the library, then, if no other questions. Bob?
Yeah, I just I want to express one concern, and Doug, you've been pretty straightforward about this, but I am concerned that we're not keeping up with the costs of the schools. I mean, the cost of the schools are going up higher than the 2.5% or 3% or whatever it is that we have. And sooner or later, we're going to hit a wall and we're going to have to do something. And you mentioned we're going to need to do that. And it's a concern of mine. I think the other aspects of town probably are kind of chugging along, but the school system seems to be a real issue. And I don't know, I don't have a solution for it. I just want to express a concern that I think we need to figure out how to maintain our schools at a high level in a sustainable way. The other question I have is, as we bring the new elementary school on board and start to think about closing down the other schools, I didn't see anything in the documents on how much we spend on each of the elementary schools. When you add it all up, what do we spend on Crocker Farm? What do we spend on Wildwood? And maybe it's there, I didn't see it. But I think it would be helpful to have that information so we know if we're closing that school, that, obviously some of those expenses will go to the new school, but some of them won't. So I think that would be a helpful thing for us to understand how much we're actually spending on each facility or at each facility,
right,
including, staff and all that. So I don't expect it right now, but I think it would be helpful to have that as we go forward.
Yeah, I think the more straightforward things that we could look at are sort of those operational expenses. And I don't think we have a good sense of what the new building's going to cost us for some of those things. Some of them will be hopefully much less expensive as we have a much more energy efficient building. But I think some of the sort of basics of what we're spending now on things like utilities and infrastructure, that sort of stuff, custodial staff. Some of the other ones that are a little trickier is like, how does the staffing change? Like, how much reduction will we really see? We will see some, efficiencies in our classes and that sort of thing. And I think back to your original question or original sort of comment relative to what are we going to do to kind of make ourselves sustainable? I mean, we have we have an expensive proposition because we have a lot of people and people are expensive. And I think that how we structure ourselves and how we go about trying to deliver those, those educational programs to kids is something we're going to have to look really deeply at over the next couple of years. And I think in concert with the conversation that we're going to start pretty soon on the more infrastructure like things, I think relative to, ways to combine with the town or work with the town staff to find ways to streamline ourselves are going to definitely be conversations we have to have. It's not, we'd like to have them. We're going to have them because I think the economic pressures are just there. And there's no, sort of manna from heaven to help us out in regard to that. So, there's definitely some work to be done and things we have to think about. And we'll probably have to make some really hard choices about what has most value to us, whether it be class sizes or what we offer, a whole host of things we have to balance in that. Back to your other point, I can definitely try to put some things together as far as what our schools cost us. We do sort of categorize our expenses mostly that way. So we can kind of put those together. We tend to, on the sort of composite sheets, kind of smush them all together. We say like school administration. Well, that's all three schools as far as the elementary school, but we do have those broken out more specifically to the buildings. And so I can put a little something together in that regard and get that to you guys as well.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful to know. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Lynn?
Yeah, I just want to make note that we did receive a memo from Paul providing some additional explanation about the fiscal sustainability working group. And that I've asked that be added to this packet and also to the packet for the council on the 15th. I think that along with our regional discussion that where we have talked about needing to take a hard look at the whole infrastructure issue of the two schools and what's coming up there. I'm assuming some of that will get folded into that larger discussion that Paul is proposing and has approached the superintendent about. So I'm not asking. I'm not asking for the comment now, just hopefully we will. Yeah.
Just an explanation, there was a memo that was received by counselors this morning, and I will send it to Bob, Matt, and Bernie, our resident members of the committee, either later tonight or tomorrow morning, so that you see it, and that's what Lynn is referring to as being added to the packet, so that you know what the process is that Paul is developing to identify this. I don't know, Paul, if you want to say anything else or let the memo ride.
Yeah, it's a very brief memo. It just sort of outlines a little bit more in slightly more detail about how we would like to move forward on it. And if there are questions, we can answer that.
So with that said, is there anything else for schools? Otherwise, I think we can move on to library, and which is the other topic for tonight in public comment, just see if there's any public comment. So Doug, thank you very much. And again, thank Mike and Allison for being here and for you hanging on.
All right, I will let them know, and thank you all very much for taking the time out and asking good questions. So thank you. And I'll be back in touch about those couple of questions you guys raised and some data that you wanted. So I'll send that along. Thank you.
Okay, and just so you know, and you can convey this along, that we're in a mode right now of meeting with functional, schools, library, and then various departments. And May 23rd, we'll begin to shift into the discussion within the Finance Committee about what our recommendation to the council will be. So great. That's what the process is. So the fact that we didn't have a discussion about, for example, the school committee request for an additional $84,000. It wasn't that we didn't hear it, but the Finance Committee didn't anticipate that this is the stage for discussion. So thank you.
Understood. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we're going to switch to library, but let me just ask real quickly. We do public comment at every meeting. I indicated at the beginning of this meeting that we were postponing public comment because the superintendent and the chair of the school committee had a limited time here, but that it is important. And so if there are any members of the public who would like to offer public comment, they should feel free to raise their hand. But it doesn't have to be the matters that we're being discussed today, but any matter that's relevant to the Finance Committee in any way, shape, or form is certainly welcome. So I'll pause for just a second to see if there are anybody who raises hands from the attendee group who would like to make comment. Seeing none, I think we can move on to the library budget. And at this point, I'm going to make the same disclosure that Anna made earlier about schools. And then I'm going to actually turn the meeting over to Anna to chair, since Kathy's not here as vice chair. I appreciate Anna that you're willing to take this role on. As most people or many people know, my wife is a part-time employee of the library working at Branch Library. And as a consequence, I have consulted with the Ethics Commission and filed notice with the town clerk, making public that there is this circumstance. However, I don't believe that anything that the Finance Committee will be recommending or the council will be acting on is going to affect the employment or benefits that are received by my wife. If they were, then I would totally remove myself from any of the meetings. However, because of that circumstance, even though I'm not going to remove myself from the meeting, I did ask Anna to chair this section, so I'm turning the meeting over to her.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to welcome Sharon Sherry, who is the library director. And Sharon, I believe that you are the only one here from the libraries. Is that correct? Is there anyone else that will be joining you?
Well, I'd like to recognize library trustees Bob Pam and Lee Edwards. After my presentation, they may have something to say, so you could bring them in now or later, whatever you think.
I don't have that power. Sean, are you able to do that?
Yes, sorry, I just grabbed water. Did you ask to bring in the
Bob,
trustees?
Bob Pam and Lee Edwards.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon. All right, so reminder to folks who are with us today, the budget and Sharon's presentation is in the packet and available on the website. And so without further ado, Sharon, I will turn it over to you, and then we will start with the pre-prepared questions, and then we'll go to any other questions from the Finance Committee or counselors, if that sounds all right to everyone here. All right.
And will you let me share my screen?
Yeah, Sean will, I think, because again, I do not have that power, but.
You should have it. If you don't, let me, is it saying no?
Hang on, no, hang on. I'm coming.
And welcome, Bob and Lee. Nice to have you with us.
And so right now I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I have also, it's a quick presentation, but I have also received your questions in advance. And so what I've done is I've interspersed the answers to those questions throughout my presentation.
Great, thank you.
Let's do. I got too many things in the way now. Hey, here we go. Multitasking. Here we go. Okay, so on your screen are our revenue sources. 75% of the library's total operating budget will come from the municipal appropriation for FY24. The appropriation is only used for staff salaries, benefits, and the rent for Munson Memorial Library. The town appropriation does not fund things like books or maintenance, utilities, or programs. State aid will account for almost 4% of our budget, and that's an important bucket because we need those funds to cover the staff salaries that the town appropriation does not cover. 9% of our budget is going to come from donations to the Friends, the sale of merchandise like t-shirts, meeting room and printing fees, and grants. And for FY24, the big grant is a multi-year federal grant that was awarded to our ESL department. 12% of our library's operating budget will come from the endowment draw in FY24. And for FY24, the trustees again approved a 4% draw rate. Now, when we say that we are withdrawing funds from the endowment, the Woodbury funds are not included in that calculation. The endowment and the Woodbury fund are treated separately because the Woodbury fund spending is determined by the Friends of the library, and that's a requirement of the Woodbury bequest. With the exception of the renovation of the Woodbury room 10 or so years ago, the Friends have historically taken a 4% draw. Usually it's a little less than that from the Woodbury fund every year. It's about $25,000, $26,000, $27,000 a year. And those funds pay for library programming and circulating materials. On June 30th of 22, the endowment was at 8.2 million and the Woodbury fund was at 660,000. 66% of the library's FY24 expenses will be that of personnel and almost 13% for benefits. Almost 9% of our budget goes towards the purchase of circulating materials such as books, magazines, all our digital content. Utilities will account for 3% of our budget, maintenance another 3%, and programming is at 2%. I know you cannot see this, but the library's FY24 budget was approved by the trustees on March 15th. So here's why FY24 is going to be complicated for us. It's because of the building project. So for half the year, we'll be located in the Jones building, and for the other half, we'll be in a swing space or an interim space. So our salaries and benefits and programming figures, those can be projected relatively easily throughout the year, regardless of where we're located. But our building related costs, like our building systems and equipment and grounds, HVAC maintenance, utilities, those are going to change halfway through the year. But in crafting this budget, we've been very conservative. So if anything, we'll spend less. Overall, we're proposing a 7% increase over FY23. And this is primarily due to the $61,000 that will come in through that ESL grant. Not counting that grant, the increase would have been 5%. Under expenses, we're showing a 6.7 increase to salaries. And why this is we'll be filling 2 of our 4 vacant positions. And we're going to be making full-time one of our part-time over 20 positions. And both of those efforts are going to help to reduce our reliance on part-time under 20 positions. Because we're filling 2 out of those 4 vacant full-time positions, along with the fact that the town health insurance costs are rising pretty bit for FY24, there's going to be a 13% increase to our benefits line. We're going to see a 0.8% increase to materials and a 10% decrease to operations. And this is primarily because I took a line, book processing, and I moved it into the materials category. However, we have also reduced staff development and some office supply lines. We're going to see a 9% decrease to our annual CW Mars assessment, a 3.6% increase to maintenance and repairs, and a 2% decrease to utilities. Programming is increasing by 138%. Again, that's due to the ESL grant. And the special collections budget is being level funded. And so a quick note about our special collections money market account. That account is from a variety of sources that has been collected over the course of many years, primarily through donations. There's a balance of approximately $50,000 in that account right now, and all of that money is restricted for use for the preservation of our archives, the collections. Under revenue sources, we're showing a 3% increase to the municipal appropriation in accordance with the town manager's directive, a 5.7% increase to the endowment draw, even though the rate is remaining at 4%, and a 151% increase in the use of state aid, and that's what we'll be using to cover the salaries. Now that the Friends are responsible for the library's fundraising efforts, the next 2 lines on your screen, gifts and grants and Friends and Woodbury, they're pretty much starting to mingle with each other. So we're heading towards that will just be one line. We are not including Sammy's income for FY24 because instead we're planning a major capital campaign event. Grants are applied for by the staff, but the restricted gifts and donations to the Friends and the Woodbury funds, those are all now under the umbrella of the Friends. So when we calculate the increase or decrease in the reliance of those funds, basically both of those lines should be added together. And for FY24, the end result is a 25% increase. Many thanks to the Friends of the Library and for all of you who donate to the Friends. The sale of merchandise, sale of goods has been transferred to the Friends. They are now in charge of buying our merchandise, buying and selling our merchandise. So that line is zeroed out for FY24. And we're projecting a 30% decrease to fees and lost books. And this is because income that we are receiving due to lost books has been decreasing over the years. So we're being conservative. Also, because we won't be in the Jones for the full year, we won't be taking in revenue through meeting room fees. And then we are increasing our use of our BE&R funds by 100%. And I was glad that you asked me about this question. So BE&R stands for Building Expansion and Renovation Account. And this dates back to the 1993 Jones Library Expansion Renovation Project. There's about $8,200 in this line. 4891 is restricted to the North Amherst Library building. So I'll be working with Jeremiah on transferring that money over to him so the town can spend that on the building. And the remaining 3,300 is for the Jones Library expansion project, this new one that's coming up. I thought I would give you a quick update on the Jones Library building project and the capital campaign. We have completed design development and expect to receive a reconciled cost estimate in late May, early June. We will then move into the construction document phase and receive the final cost estimate late November. We would then go out to bid in late November and award a contract with a general contractor in February 24. Construction would begin in March of 24. And then 18 months later, give or take, the grand opening celebration would take place in December of 25. So as long as that timeline isn't delayed, the trustees would owe its final memorandum of agreement payment to the town in July of 26. And that is the same time that the town would receive the final disbursement from the MBLC. Because we can only receive one MBLC disbursement per fiscal year, if there are any changes to the timeline, it would push back the final MBLC disbursement to July of 27. Speaking of the trustees' share of project costs, towards its goal of raising 16 million, the capital campaign has received grants, earmarks, gifts, and statements of intention totaling almost 5.8 million. I wanted to also point out that we submitted our first Massachusetts Historic Tax Credits application, for which we expect to be rejected. And this is the norm. This is what happens 99.9% of the time for the first application. The benefit to submitting early, knowing that we're going to get rejected, is along with that rejection, we will get comments and suggestions and requirements, things that we need to change. And so we will address those comments in our August application. We will continue to apply so it's 3 times a year, every January, April, and August, each year until the end of our project. And we can receive about $2 million from these efforts over these next few years. Also, as you know, we've been working with Senator Comerford and Representative Dome over the past year in an effort to receive additional state funding for the project due to COVID-related cost escalation. And this could result in the neighborhood of an additional $4 million-ish. That was all my prepared comments. I'm happy to take more questions.
Thank you so much. Sharon, just to confirm, there weren't any questions. Oh, okay. I was going to say, I will turn this over to Lynn because I also want to thank Lynn for being the person who compiled the questions on the library. And Lynn, were there any additional questions that you had before we open it up to the committee?
First of all, Sharon has, I think, addressed all of the questions. I do have one that kind of expands beyond that. And we can probably go ahead and take down the presentation. But the response to the questions are in your packet as well. And I want to thank Sharon for those written responses in advance and for incorporating into your presentation now the responses to those questions. So, but I do want to push on one, and this is really a question for probably Sean and Paul. And that is, to me, it's a little confusing to see money related to the actual building in the budget. So I'm trying to figure out, how does that sort out when we do the renovation expansion? Although what I'm hearing is the renovation expansion line in this budget is from the previous time. Yes?
Yeah, so to clarify, it's used for repairs, building repairs. And basically what I'm gonna do, the money for the Jones expansion project, once town council votes again, I will work with Sean, and I have several other funds. I forget what the total is, but I will basically be cutting a check and sending it all over to Sean so that those funds can be used for
So
that.
we'll be
building
keeping
project.
a separate account
Yeah.
of the building and the renovation and expansion
Yeah.
under a separate accounting. I'm looking at Paul, I'm looking at Sean, I'm looking.
We have a few things. So we have a fund that's set up dedicated to the library building project. Within that fund, there's a borrowing, which is the authorization that for the town share. There's the grant funding, which we have the first payment of, and that will be where we store any of the grant payments in the future. And then we have a donation account, and so any of the fundraising, anything like that, and I think there's already been an initial payment that goes into this donation account. So it really depends sort of on what the nature is of what Sharon sends us. If it's fundraising, we would put in our donation account. If it's something else, we would classify it based on what it is, but we would make sure it's dedicated to the project.
Okay. And then because we now have 2 big capital projects moving forward, I'm going to ask Paul and Sean on behalf of the Finance Committee, how do we now see those accounts? And will we see them quarterly like we do the regular fiscal updates? Or how will the Finance Committee and the Town Council see accounts associated to major building projects?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. What I recommend, and we can figure out a way to do this, is that there's going to be reports, and there have been reports that are already given to building committees dedicated to these projects, and we can make, they're already, I believe, posted, but we can make them available to the Finance Committee and the Council. So for example, once a month, the OPM for the Jones Library project presents a budget overview of how the project's doing from a budgetary standpoint. Again, very early on, so it's not super exciting at this point, but that same type of thing will happen with the school project. And so I think instead of recreating it, we can just share those reports and then answer any questions you have.
My goal is not to undercut, question, or in any way suggest that the building committees aren't doing their job. It's just that in both cases, the town council has authorized significant money. And I think we need to make sure that the Finance Committee, where we've always agreed large capital projects are, if you will, funded from or recommended from or whatever. We just need to be, have updates as well.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. And Paul and I can think maybe the town manager report too, maybe makes sense at some point.
Yeah, but we can put those documents into the Finance Committee's folder. We get them monthly from this building committees, and the building committees look at that. Each building committee has to approve every invoice that is spent out of those funds.
Oh yeah,
so those are actual actions by the building committee. And then, and as in that process, there is an updated sort of progress report on all the finances. So I'm not sure if you want to talk about them at every Finance Committee meeting. You're welcome to do that, but having them in your packet might be a good way to store them in a way. They're also on both the building committees' websites as well.
I just think that some, and the chair of the Finance Committee and so forth can discuss, do we want kind of a quarterly update at the same time we look at the budget quarterly or something, just so that we continue to be good stewards of the town money.
Right.
It's huge.
And you have representation on both of those committees as well, as you know.
That's exactly right. Yes. Thank you. Again, I'm done with my questions.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the committee, either finance or council committees? Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, this is maybe a question for Bob, Pam, rather than for Sharon, but I'm interested in the stability of the endowment. I know that in the past, we've talked about the endowment may be tapped if the fundraising doesn't quite reach the finish line. And I just want to make sure, I know that I saw on the graph, there was a big drop. Everyone lost money in the stock market at that time. So was that sort of just the stock market, or was it kind of more of a, are you concerned about the long-term stability of the endowment? I guess that's the question.
Well, the answer to the first question is yes, that was the stock market. I'm not taking any money out. How stable is it? You tell me what the economy is going to look like next year. I can't give you an answer on that. With the long-term expectation is that the endowment will grow at least, I can't say at least, at roughly the same rate as our withdrawal rates. So 4 or 5% is a conservative estimate of what happens when you invest money, and that is essentially what we are doing. We're doing it in a conservative way. The other half of your question is, at the point where the project is moving forward, and if there are delays in receiving money through our fundraising, that could be a draw upon us. And we have been talking about the possible ability to get external sources through mass development, through other kinds of activities that would be practical, useful, which would not endanger the operations of the library, but which we would still have to repay over a reasonably short period of time. But it would then mean that the endowment itself does not take a sudden and immediate hit. Can't tell you how that will all work out, but that is where we are going with that. And that will obviously depend upon the success of the fundraising.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Jennifer?
Yeah, I just had a question. I might have been in this budget and I just wasn't seeing it, but there will be some expenses associated with the library having to move out into different locations. And is that in this budget, or is that something that separate?
No, that's in the building project
Okay.
package. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Library Director Sharon Sherry, Bob Pam, or Lee Edwards? All right, well, we know that they're always happy to answer any questions that do come up, but we appreciate you all taking the time today. Thank you so much for the thoughtful presentation and for responding to the questions ahead of time. We appreciate that. And with that, you are free to enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. And I will turn it back over to Andy.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that we're pretty well done with the agenda for today, because it was principally the two topics that we discussed. I don't think that we have any further minutes as of today that I can take up. And I have no unanticipated matters to raise. So unless anybody else does and would like to raise anything else.
Andy, can I just say two quick things? So I'll post in the packet all the questions that we've received so far that we have responses. So that'll include the sets that you heard tonight, and some of the capital ones from previous meeting and so on. And then just a heads up that we are likely going to be rescheduling the public health department and the fire department to a later meeting. They were originally scheduled, I think, for actually Friday, but both of those departments have conflicts, so they'll likely be the 23rd. So if anybody was looking for those, just a heads up that they're going to shift.
But otherwise, the public safety and community services is the major topics of Friday, and all other departments and possibly fire, because we haven't confirmed that yet, might be switching just public health. So and the public safety, of course, includes CRES as well as police dispatch, in addition to fire.
Animal control.
So,
And that'll be Friday.
Welfare, I'm sorry, you're right.
Right.
We control them.
so Anna,
That's Friday, yeah.
yeah, your question? Or-
I do have a question. Andy, would you be able to send out, I hear the update about fire. I could not find an updated version of that document with the dates. I know that I am the person who's collecting the questions and writing the memo for public safety, and I'm not able to be there for the bulk of the meeting on Friday. And so I wasn't sure if you had an updated list, if I had missed that somehow, and I apologize if I had missed it. But I also will use this time to just remind the counselors who are here to please send me any questions that you have on that section of the budget, because I want to make sure that I get them out. And now it's Tuesday, and so I'd like to get them to Sean tomorrow morning, to give him at least 24 hours to consider that. And I'm going to send an email to the council as soon as this meeting ends. But Andy, if there are any other public safety folks who also have a slight conflict Friday, I would not be upset if they needed to move that as well to a point where I can be there. And I apologize that I'm not able to be here for the full meeting on Friday.
John will have to answer that question because he's the one who keeps tabs of who can be there when.
Yeah, I think everybody else, I haven't heard anybody else is unavailable, and given our sort of tight window. And Andy was actually planning on sending out the revised schedule that you mentioned. He's got it updated. I just need to confirm with fire before he can send it out.
Perfect, thank you. And no, I definitely did not mean to suggest that the department heads needed to readjust their schedule. Thank you.
Yep.
John, I just want to confirm, did you get the questions I sent in?
Yep.
Great.
I've received them and they've been sent off
Great.
to Guilford. Yep.
Thanks.
And Pam?
What is the date that the general discussion will take place when the finance committee starts to make its recommendations?
We still plan to start on the 23rd and then follow it at the next meeting after that. There is a consolidated budget planning calendar, and I was going to update it, but I'm still waiting for just final answer about fire department availability before I do it.
So even though there appears to now be a presentation that day, it'll be presentation and the beginning of discussion. Sounds like.
Yes, it will be, and we started. There was a very difficult topic that was raised, and I think we'll hold discussion, even information about how we can proceed with that issue, which is, of course, the school committee request for additional funds and what the options are that are available to the council, things like that. We won't go back to that till the 23rd. Jennifer.
A very quick question. So whenever the committee meets on Tuesdays, it's this time, 5:30 to 7:30.
Yes.
1 to 4 Friday. Okay, thank you.
Yes. As I say, we have the consolidated budget calendar, and with Lynn's permission, I'll send it to the entire council when it's approved by Sean, which should be tomorrow. Lynn?
Yeah, I also just want to bring up that when the finance committee begins to develop its report, we go back to the people who did the thorough review and the questions, and Andy asks us to draft some initial portion of the report around that. And so the sooner we get some examples, because as you can imagine, with all the different people writing, it looks like apples and oranges, and then Andy has to make it look like lemonade. So it's really important to understand that we still have a writing assignment that goes with our being the person that raised the questions. Okay. And I know I personally always want to go back and review the tapes and so forth when I'm trying to do that, because I don't take all the specific notes I should.
And real quickly, to Lynn's point, people whose departments had already presented, you could start working on that now if you wanted to, so that it's not a crunch at the end.
I mean, it's not, you can't finalize until we have our last discussion, but that report will be due to the council on June 1st and will be then discussed at the council meeting on June 5th. Did I get my dates right? Actually, I think it's due the 31st because it's due 30 days after we receive the budget.
Let me, I want to try and share screen to show what the document looks like now. The way that it's written is the 23rd was going to be the initial discussion for the finalized recommendation, and then finish that work on the 26th, when we'll actually, if there are any issues that come up that are identified on the 23rd, we won't vote on them on the 23rd, but we try and vote on the 26th so that we have a complete set of recommendations ready. And then the 30th is when we have the final meeting to try and review the budget draft as it's been put together as of that date. So because we do need to get it to the council, and you know, whether I think if you call it the 30th or the 31st, it's probably the 31st is the actual date. So that said,
yeah, I'm going to adjourn the council, but before I do that, I just want to thank the counselors who have come, who are not on the finance committee, as well as the ones who are. As you've, I think, observed, because I think some of you were also here last year, this is really a great way to learn about our town. Financial budgets really provide lots of good information. So thanks for spending the time to attend yet another committee meeting.
It makes so much more sense the second year than last year, I have to say.
Yes.
So
Thank you.
with that,
So the council is adjourned.
And the finance committee is also adjourned. So thank you, and see you on Friday.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Sure.